conversation. It's the conversation. Y'all ready? Let's go. No filter, no restrictions. You about to give my opinion in its purest form. So my words, don't try to spin them. What I said is what I said. And what I said, I meant it. The gloves are off now when I'm coming out swinging. So engage in verbal combat, but you better be ready. Cause this here for me is light work, even if the topic's heavy. I'm ready for it all with no running from nothing. You just take the time to digest what I put in, no rushing. But time is moving, don't waste it. You want the real, come and face it. Come sit and talk to me if you want it straight without a chaser. And it might burn a little when you step on up to taste it. But it's nothing harsh, I promise. Just a little conversation.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the conversation. I have a great guest for you, and then there's Greg. So I have Dr. Megan Millay with me today, economist, and we're going to have a good chat with her. And of course, I have Greg from Greg's Trading Place, formerly known as Weenie Trades Live. And of course, we have our two people who used to wear blazers and take this seriously, Dr. David Hayes and Harold Ford. All right. Deflated by inflation. So we're going to talk about inflation today, and we have our political gas bags on here, Dr. David Hayes and Harold, that'll talk about that. We're going to talk about some effects of the market. And Megan's here to make sure we don't put our foots in our mouths. No, I'm just kidding. So, Megan, I want to start with you. And just so everyone out there understands, what exactly is inflation? Just so everybody understands what inflation is.
Well, I think everybody has a feel for inflation because they go to the grocery store and they see their prices going up. But inflation, by a macroeconomics definition, is just that the overall price level is increasing. And so within there may be some prices that are increasing a lot, and there may be some prices that are increasing a little bit, and there could be even prices that are going down. But we have to have some measure on what does it mean to be the overall price level. And so we have different kinds of indexes that we use, and we look to see what's happening to the growth rate of those indexes. Common ones are the consumer price index, the implicit price deflator, which is based on GDP numbers, or the GDP deflator. And then there's the personal consumption expenditure one. So there's a few different kinds of measures that you use, and they all have something that's great about them, and they all have something that's not quite so great about them, but they're all just sort of looking at what's going on with the overall price level.
Now, were you going to say something, Greg?
Yeah, I completely agree. And a big point about inflation is that it's eroding the purchasing power.
I just want to get this clear. You agree with the economist. I just want to make sure that's clear. Okay, thank you. Thank you for agreeing on an economic.
I hope you agree on a basic definition of inflation, or we're going to be
We're setting a low bar.
Go ahead, Greg.
That's basically all I really had to add. That was really good.
I just like to get definitions out there because me and Megan were talking about before the show. A lot of times people think they know what something means based on whoever they've heard it from, and they get the actual definition wrong. One of the myths, and I'd love Harold and Dave to chime in about this, is people think presidents have a direct influence on when inflation happens, or inflation is caused by that particular president who's in office. Dave?
Well, yeah. I mean, I always, presidents have very limited impacts on things, and there can be things. You can do things and have an impact on prices, and Trump coming up with an agreement to curtail production in OPEC for 2 years would have had an impact, on one element of the basket of goods that we use to measure inflation. But even there, right, where you could point to something that I think we could go and criticize, nevertheless, that's going to be one little thing. So I'm always pushing back on the idea that presidents, or even that the government has control over prices. Controlling prices is well, it's just best not to be done. But we can get more to that.
Harold, you wanted to chime in? I saw you mouthing something over there.
Well, I mean, knowing that it's a supply versus demand response, and knowing that, even if we look at the previous administration and that agreement that Dave referenced with OPEC, that not long after the the administration change, you saw gas prices going up because of that, that agreement to lower production. And as a result of gas prices going up, what that had a ripple effect, where it affected transportation. Well, those transportation costs were absorbed by those grocers. Now those grocers did what in response? Raised their prices. And even though gas prices have come down, comparatively speaking, we still see those grocery prices being, remaining at the levels that they are, which also has people, really crying out to try to figure out and really understand, why are we here? If the gas prices have gone down, why didn't those grocers also do that? Because they're reporting record profits as we move on. But I don't want to kind of move into a different direction. I'm gonna land my plane.
That's okay. That's
good.
why. Oh, so that's why a gallon of milk is $17. Gotcha. But what you just said goes to something we talked about a couple shows ago about how a lot of people will think because something is happening during that president's reign that that's president's fault or that administration's fault of why that happened. And you guys usually do a great job of putting down the breadcrumbs so people can see where it started. I have a chicken or the egg question for you. Okay. It might be dumb to you, but hey, people ask this question. When you're looking at the market, because you're looking at it every day,
Mm-hmm.
can you kind of see based on what you're looking at that inflation's about to come up, or does inflation happen and then it affects the market?
It's kind of like a feedback loop. It's tough to say whether it's that specifically. Again, inflation's really more so driven by increased demand in the overall economy. And if there's a lot more money, quantitative easing, meaning the Federal Reserve expanding their balance sheet, that's going to cause a little bit more inflation. So you can kind of see it in the bond market. I don't want to get too nerdy, but if you see interest rates really starting to skyrocket, that's because those bondholders, they want to get a higher interest rate as inflation is going higher. So if you see interest rates spiking up, yeah, I mean, inflation is, probably running rampant. You can usually also see it in commodity prices, in oil prices, in gold prices. So if you see commodities spiking up, inflation might be, on the uptrend.
I gotta weigh in since you said chicken and egg here,
Yeah,
because one of the difficulties of this, and this is why we should defer to people like Megan on a lot of these issues,
definitely.
or to to other folks who look at it. Um, Bond prices, right? Like, yeah, that's going to be a thing. If there's inflation, people are going to want their interest
Higher yield.
rates to be positive, real interest rates to be positive, right? They're not
Mhm.
going to want 2% interest rate if
Yeah,
there's 5%
it's like
inflation. However, at the same time, we know there's something called the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is worried about interest. They're going to war. They're coming out swinging, and where are they doing it? In the bond market, right? And so you have that. You also have are commodity prices coming up because of inflation, or are they a driver of inflation, right? And so there are a lot of things that you need to untangle in a pragmatic, empirical fashion, and that is what is deviling, because people, honestly, like me, sometimes we learn. I've learned a lot more than the average, but we learned some theories and some ideas, and they make sense. Like quantitative easing, like yes, hey, absolutely, all that money we sent to people, all that we just added $10 trillion to the deficit. We
Yeah.
gave money to people in COVID. Clearly, that means that consumers have money, and it's driving, just as Greg said, and he's not wrong, right? The
There's
demand
more
of
to it than that.
consumers is a big part of this. But at the same time, a lot of the research is like, well, that didn't have as much of an effect as other things like supply chain issues. And so that's where we really need to kind of check the dipstick and see what's actually happening.
Megan,
Really
did you
well
want to
said.
chime
I
in?
want to hear what Megan has to say about this. as well.
About this, the quantitative easing, the source of inflation, all of the above.
I just like hearing you speak.
Okay.
I just like hearing you speak. I'm a CMT, by the way. I'm a chartered market technician, so I'm like a
Yes.
chart nerd.
Which he
I'm not
reminds us
exact.
every show.
Yep.
Well, check, we've got that done.
Yeah, there we go.
Greg has reminded us. Okay, so sources of inflation. Typically, you have supply side, you have demand side, you have cost push inflation, you have demand pull inflation, and then you have the Federal Reserve and having expansionary monetary policy, which is the quantitative easing thing that they've been talking about in some ways. The Federal Reserve recently came out saying that they're going to slow down their quantitative easing. So that is kind of a step in the direction of slowing down some of the things that they've been doing lately. So supplies, like, okay, so the role of the let me go back lots of different places. The role of the president in deciding how the economy, like impacting how the economy is doing. Policy wise, no. Um, Sometimes that when we think about the drivers of the demand side, the biggest chunk of it is consumption. That's Greg had pointed that out. It's definitely the biggest piece. It's about 2/3 of the size of GDP. So if it moves at all, you definitely notice it. And so consumer spending has been pretty resilient, even though we've seen a lot of inflation, and they're spending money on a lot of services, and so there's a lot of complaining that inflation is high, but we're not really seeing the difference between the complaint and the action. So their stated preferences versus their revealed preferences from the consumer side. So we're still seeing consumption doing some driving on that. There was a lot of supply side stuff that was going on, after, COVID. And we got what I thought was really interesting in looking at the post COVID environment. There was some interesting things around policies and policies, tapering off and stuff. But the thing that I found to be the most interesting was because when the economy is moving right along with production, you don't really know how long things take to produce and where they are in the supply chain. And I thought it was really neat to see that, like, what are the things that sort of went down first? And you saw some screeching halts, and then like 6 months later, you saw another set of things going, and you're like, oh, I had no idea that meat packing was going to be something that, like, it was just amazing to me to watch, different things. Oh, the car sector is really, being hammered now, and oh, we're really struggling with imported goods. And so it was interesting to see, because when it's all working, you don't get to splice and dice it. And so we got to see lots of supply side shocks. And they occurred to me in an unexpected way because I don't know how long it takes to produce. How long does it take for a shock that hits the auto industry to then have an impact on the production of automobiles? How long does it take to have employment interruptions in the meat packing to have it translate into you can't buy sandwich meat at the grocery store? I just had never seen the link between those things. I mean, I knew that they existed, but I just had no idea the timing.
And then if it's something that everybody notices food, but if it's something that, like, for instance, I'm probably the only one on here during that period that was annoyed because it took a year and a half for me to get a PlayStation 5. I'm probably the only one that was annoyed and you're not paying attention.
No, I think that there were loads of people who, because there was a
No,
lot.
I mean on this show.
Oh, on
On
this
this
show.
show. Yeah, if you're not, like, I'm sure Harold wasn't paying attention to the PlayStation 5 epidemic,
I was
but
paying attention
me,
to the
being a PlayStation
I
owner,
was really upset about the goggle things.
the VR goggles,
Apple
Yeah,
Vision
the
Pro?
VR ones, whatever that's called.
you finally wanted one and you couldn't get your hands on one.
I couldn't get my hands on it. I was checking like online all the time, and mostly because I wanted my kids to have one so they would leave me alone. Right?
Well, this is also,
I needed a new capital intensive way to parent.
well, electronics are affected greatly because what happens when these things happen is, I'm going to use the goggles and the PlayStation 5, for instance. People want them so much, it's about $500, but you'll have people that get their hands on 2 and 3, and then they're trying to sell them for $1,500 because someone will buy it, But I wanted to make a comment and then ask a question. Dave, you were talking earlier, and everybody has mentioned supply and demand. One of the things that always fascinated me being 20 years in the Army is Every time I went on a deployment, we get paid a heck of a lot more money, right? When we come back to Fort Stewart, Georgia, Hinesville, there'd be all these signs that say, "Welcome back, soldiers. We love you. We support you." And then when you go to get your apartment, you realize apartments have gone up $400 and everything around town now costs more upon our arrival, and it didn't 2 months earlier. And it's like, really? You love us so much, but now you're raising everything around town. Great.
Right. But why are you shocked?
I'm not
Right. I
shocked.
mean,
I just,
you've got two things in there. A bunch of people went away,
uh-huh.
right? So the demand for whatever it is you're talking about went down.
Yeah,
And then those people came back with more money,
yeah.
right?
This is the
And
conversation.
so that's the demand side, right? Your consumers are coming in and out. And
And that's the only side that we're looking at when we come back. Great, you drove up all the prices, but we're not looking at the side of, yeah, but 20% of the population of that town has been gone for a year and haven't been buying anything.
right.
Mhm.
So we don't look at that side as the
Yeah.
person being affected. Yeah.
But and the thing is though, because there's also that supply side, like you said, these companies that, one was, through the pandemic, we saw one of the things that I think is very interesting is always how much changes in demand, unexpected changes in demand, screw up everybody. Right? It's the tickle me Elmo, which goes back way long. But every year there's a toy at Christmas that the producers, if they knew that you wanted it, they would have made infinite numbers.
Awesome.
But they didn't, and so suddenly people who were never going to buy spend the money on this thing, they changed. So the pandemic did that, but then we had the supply chain disruptions, right? Because that's the other side is your ability to supply these things. And do you have the ability to supply the demand? And it takes a while, like Megan's saying, it takes a while to meet that. And so we saw all of that as drivers of inflation. It's interesting to me that companies didn't jack prices as much as they could have. That they typically, car manufacturers, when we had the chip shortage, they did they, if they were hyper rational, right, like a Milton Friedman kind of view of somebody, they would have jacked the prices on the cars to where to meet the scarcity value, so that there would have been a number of cars. Like if you wanted a car and were willing to pay a lot for it, you could have gotten one. But these guys kind of stuck to MSRP, maybe with a surcharge, and ended up they accepted having empty lots with leaving some amount of profit in the on the table. And that's where your secondary market came in, right? Your secondary market was people who were able to extract that last measure. And so it's always interesting to me how restrained sometimes these companies are. We talk about them price gouging all the time, but
They
in
could go
practice,
harder.
I'd say the restraint is there as much.
Well, for as much as we're talking about people raising prices, like you just said, one thing that happened during that time was because everyone's homes, things that used to cost a lot of money went down significantly. Webcams became cheaper. A lot of people started streaming, like me. Streaming equipment became so much cheaper. Buying streaming equipment before 2020 could break your bank sometimes if you got the right setup. And now that became more. But I want to talk about the people who are affected the most, in my view. I may be wrong, but people who are middle to lower income that live in more expensive places. Like if you live in, let's say, Durham, North Carolina, may not affect you as much as someone with the medium income that lives in Miami. Harold, you live in Miami. That's already an expensive place to live. And then inflation happens. What does that do to people in that community who don't make a lot of money?
Well, we're also looking at the fact that, when you're looking at just looking at groceries alone, we're not going to talk about rents. We're not going to talk about insurance. We're not going to talk about home ownership, because those, I mean, right now, Florida as a whole is out of control. And our legislature has basically taken any and all, controls off of the insurance companies to allow what's happening to happen in Florida. But when I look at also, people often refer to groceries, purchasing groceries here. I'm also, The size of a Snickers bar doesn't even look the same, but I'm paying almost 1.5 times more.
Shrinkflation.
So
Well,
you're
that's not as
shrinking.
bad as the potato chip bag, where it's actually like 15% of the bag has potato chips in it, and the rest is air.
But we're seeing a lot of these things take place, and what used to be our normal, I guess, methods of measuring or measurements, the half gallon, the pint, the quart. We don't see that anymore. As not as much as we had seen in the past. So those things have been cut by 10, maybe 15%, but we're paying even more for those particular items, which again, it contributes to the challenges that we face as consumers in this inflationary period. And again, who do we blame? Where do we go? Who can we say, how do we address this issue? Because again, we want free market capitalism, which means you can't have the government telling people how much to charge for eggs or how much to charge for bacon or whatever the case may be. So it's a challenge, but my thing is I'm still fishing or throwing my hook out there to try to figure out how can I maneuver in this new landscape that we're currently experiencing.
We have a
Good
question
question.
from the email, which everybody, if you're watching, it's great that you have the email, but it's the slowest way for me to get the question out. So if you could actually come on and put it in the chat, that would be great. The question is because someone said in the email, an economist, someone always says an economist should be president, but we're trying to well, don't laugh.
Vote for
Ready,
Megan.
Megan?
I vote for Megan. Okay.
But you guys, from what, and tell me if I'm hearing wrong, is that you're saying that wouldn't make any, that doesn't do anything because the president has limited effect of what happens when inflation happens and all of that. Again, I'm trying to convey what they're asking plainly in the email, so don't look at me like I'm crazy. Why? So, because he said, why shouldn't an economist just be president and we would have all of this fixed? That's not true, Megan, is it?
Yeah, if you gave me all power, I could make the whole world wonderful. Yeah, you have those
The
wishes for world
authoritarian.
peace and everybody, a chicken in every pot. Yeah, just put an economist in charge. Well, we have, you've
Well, Megan, hold on. We can put an economist as president, and we need a political scientist as her vice president. There we go. You
No,
and Dave.
no, no,
Mm.
no.
Um, economists are pretty famous for doing things like on the one hand and on the other hand, and that's not really a great role for
The
a
leader.
president, right? One of the
Yeah.
things that we try to do is we try to look at things from lots of different sides and then tell you what the possible options of those outcomes are going to be. So, economists are the people who, before you play a board game, will read the directions for an hour and a half, or you write a report and there's the interesting stuff is down in the footnotes and we spend all the time down there. And so it may not be the greatest idea to have an economist because the speeches would be really boring and there might not be a lot of decisions going on. But having economists in a position where they can inform the decision makers, yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, and
Mm.
there are a couple of things too to throw in there. Um, as someone who styles himself a political economist, which makes economists' eyes roll. There's a great saying out there that that economists will frequently use, that there's no such thing as solutions, only trade-offs. And that goes to that one, FDR complained he wanted one-armed economists because they kept saying on the other hand, and he
Right.
was having a lot of difficulty. And here's a guy who was writing the book on how to deal with depressions, right? With recessions in a modern world. And we started out on that and we built on it over time. Um, a key thing, by the way, the Federal Reserve, right? The Federal Reserve used to be a political appointment, used to be controlled by the presidency. But then it was decided that that was stupid because all they would, they were under incredible pressure to pump up an economy prior to an election,
Yep.
and we're getting these political business cycles more. And so they made the Fed independent, right? So we have we took this important task away from presidents and gave it to economists.
Economists.
And they've done pretty good job with it, right? But it's so narrow. They have this narrow mandate, and within that, they get together and they do a really great job of their economists. They do research. They get a lot of information, but they're that solution basically exists already in the form of the Federal Reserve.
Mm-hmm. And they change the interest rates to affect inflation. So you kind of have a choice. Do you want higher interest rates? The cost to borrow money is higher, but it should fight inflation because you're squashing demand, you're reducing demand. Or you can have lower interest rates that'll increase demand in the economy, but you're going to get higher inflation because there's increased, borrowing and spending in the total economy. So you kind of have to, walk a fine line and, really define your goals. How much inflation do you want for how long? What do you want to do to the economy? Um, and even on like an individual note, we're really talking about a lot about supply and demand. And what a business or a company can do is a price elasticity equation to find out how does a change in price affect demand. And if you can find that perfect sweet spot, that's where you kind of get the Goldilocks scenario. What's the perfect price where we can still operate and run business? The consumer isn't tapped out, and there's not too much, inflation. We can actually operate and still profit. And it depends on how greedy or not greedy do you want to be.
Is AI gonna limit? You know how there used to be travel agents, but we can kind of do that on our own now. Is AI gonna get rid of the economist?
It's a good question. I don't know. Maybe eventually one day.
Doubtful. I think
Did you say hopefully or doubtful?
doubtful.
Oh, okay.
Might take a few.
I could see, I'm a game theorist, or I used to be. I got old. I can't do the math anymore.
Wait, my hearing's going out. Did you say game theorist or gay theorist?
Whichever you want.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
I'm going to say that Wednesday afternoon, I'm going game theorist. Now, if it's Saturday night at 11 o'clock,
I'm asleep.
I don't know. You're
I'm
kind of
telling-
handsome. I'm
telling
kind of
your wife.
mellow. I'm straight, but not narrow.
Telling
Anyway,
your wife.
you went
my
there.
Wow.
You went there. You triggered this. You
That's
have
true.
yourself to blame. The point, though, is that you have this huge amount of math you got to do to solve for equilibrium. You got to solve like 5, 6, 7
There's so many
simultaneous
variables.
equations. AI is getting to where it's going to be able to do that, right? And so it's going to be a very powerful tool for a lot of stuff, and it will certainly enable things. The thing, though, is does that do away with someone who knows the question to ask? And you got to define the 6 simultaneous equations before you solve them, and you've got to basically create your model and look at things. And then so there are going to be things that AIs will not be able to do, but they will be incredibly useful assistants. And if I was young, I would be really excited about an AI helping me solve for equilibrium in a asymmetric information game, right? That was just like this math I couldn't get to, but an AI would be able to do it, and then I could interpret the results and write a paper and be cool. The AIs are not quite there on that, but I think they'll be a powerful ally.
Technological advance has changed the way we've done economics over my career, probably over David's too, if he's talking about doing the math, because at one point we would sit down and write it out. We would have papers, pages and pages of sitting there and doing calculations, and now you type it into a program and it does the math for you. And so as we move through and have technological advance, we get to have better, more detailed models. We get to have a better understanding of how things are working, and we don't have to spend our time inverting matrices to solve for the system of equations. We have programs that will help us do that. So I think that AI is, it's like any other technological advance. It's cool, it's different, it's new, it's gonna be change the way that we do things, change the way that we think. It's going to expand our horizons. Along the way, there's going to be hiccups, but this is what we've been doing the whole time. This isn't news.
Jesse 1672, and I don't think that's the year he was born, says, I know how to know when inflation is coming when they start handing out stimulus checks.
Well, there's your
I
cause and effect.
think he's a little late though on the end of the spectrum. But anyway, my question is, and maybe Megan and or Dave can give me some insight, is basically from a policy perspective. Is there a way to identify specific policies that have caused us to go into that inflationary cycle that has come up? Because I know when we look at the last two, i.e., Republican presidents, we've gone into economic downturns that I don't know if they were expected when those policies were enacted at the time. I don't know if they're connected to tax cuts or other things that are going on. But again, I think it would be advantageous to kind of share some light on that specific area to see what can be done to avoid future instances of this nature.
Megan,
I'll let you go first. I'll let you go first.
Okay, there have been a few different things that I wanted. One thing I wanted to touch base on that I sort of neglected, and I think that it would be interesting, or like, never mind. The target inflation rate, when you hear the inflation rate and whether it's high or whether it's low, you need to know what it's supposed to be so that you can know what to expect next. So, for anyone who doesn't know, it's 2%. The target inflation rate is 2%. So, we're at above, 3% and above, and so that means that the inflation rate is high. When the inflation rate was close to 9% last summer, oh my gosh, that was super high, right? But we'd had inflation that was at the 1% range for a really long time. And so what we had done, and there is a desire to always have the economy be in some perfect state. We want the price level, we want inflation to be low, we want the unemployment rate to be low, and if the unemployment rate goes up above 4%, we start freaking out. If the inflation rate goes above 2%, we start freaking out. And there's no there's no perfect silver bullet that makes that all better. But I can say that we have a propensity for expansionary policies. We want the cake, we want the candy, and we don't necessarily have a great appetite for austerity. Or so if the economy starts going into a recession, we go fix it, fix it, fix it. And if the economy's in a boom, we're like, ooh, let's let it ride. And the way that it's supposed to work, the math of it is supposed to work is just like our own budgets. When there's boom periods, we're supposed to put some of that away for when there is a down period, so that over time we balance out. But what we tend to do is we want it to be when it's stinky, we want it to be great really fast. So we use expansionary monetary policy, we use expansionary fiscal policy to try to fix things. But then when things are booming, we don't want to do the opposite. And I don't care what horse you ride through this economic landscape, but you need to stay on the same one. So if you're going to be use monetary policy to expand, you also need it to contract. If you're going to use fiscal policy, you need it to expand and to contract. And if you're not going to use policy and you wait for the markets to self-correct, then you got to be tolerant. You got to wait for prices to change. In all of those situations, the models balance out over time. But what we tend to do is let it ride, use market adjustments during booms, and use expansionary policies during recessions. So then we have expansionary bias, inflation, and debt. And we've had expansionary monetary policy. Guys, we've had it since 9/11. And so we've been seeing that inflation track. We've seen it coming down the track for years, years. And now it's here. And we're like, okay, well, this has been coming on for a while. And teaching macroeconomics during 1% inflation and saying inflation's the thing we should watch out for, it's been like talking into the wind. Nobody's been listening.
Here's my experience with this is I started teaching. I'm a political scientist guy, okay, but I would teach international economics and I have to teach basic things, and I would teach about employment and inflation and this idea that there was the NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of employment, and the Phillips curve, right? That if your employment gets too low, your inflation's going to go up. And in the 90s, I started teaching this. And through the whole time I've taught it, I've always used the submarine analogy. Like, we're in a U-boat, we're going down. We know that there's a crush depth. We're not sure where. And it just kept getting lower. We kept seeing lower and lower and lower unemployment rates, and the inflation never materialized. And it got to the point of like, we know it's got to happen, but it didn't. So I spent my whole career, I'm about to retire. And can I just also point out, we had the other thing about this, we didn't see a pandemic coming, right? And we just had an epic event, right? This global pandemic with this crash. And in the United States, we suffered from 9% inflation for a year or so. I mean, we had a brief period of 9% inflation. What's Argentina's inflation rate today? I mean, when you go around the world, I'm impressed. I think we should look at it our economists, our policymakers, did a great job of navigating these shoals. They might have bumped up on a rock here or there, but to come out with not only that's your cost is not. Now, by the way, we have $10 trillion more in debt. That might come back on us, but that inflation rate, I think, is really amazing that that's all we had. And now we're just 1% above the ideal or the target.
Greg, you were going to chime in.
No, I completely agree. I think they did do a decent job navigating it. It comes down to, what are your goals? They basically said, hey, we're going to experience some higher inflation to kind of get us out of this pandemic. So that's kind of their thought process. The question becomes, okay, should we raise rates to get rid of inflation, or should they ride it out? And that's where it really comes down to, if we can ride it out, then it comes down to, what are some practical tips that we can do to survive day to day or make extra money? How do we combat or profit from inflation? And that's where, you can, when prices are low, try to buy a little bit more, buy in bulk when you're at the grocery store. There's some other things, when it comes down to debt, maybe pay off your highest interest rate debt first, and then you can, snowball from there. There's, obviously cutting costs, cut subscriptions that you don't use. And maybe when, the prices come back down, you can get those subscriptions again. Of course, there's a lot of different stocks and things that you can buy. You can invest in commodities. You can invest in inflation protected bonds. But it really comes down to, what is the overall goal of the Federal Reserve, and how do you fit within that narrative?
Pay off all your loans, huh? Well, you know how I paid off all my loans, Greg?
How?
I got more loans. So I did this thing. I had like 12 loans. I did this thing where I just kept getting lower interest loans, and then I would take the money and pay off the highest one until I got all the way down to my 2 lowest loans, and those are the 2 that I've been paying off. I was like, because it was killing me. But we are. You talked about debt. We always talked about we're a nation in debt. Most people are in debt. And that's a thing. That's a reality. One question. Oh, I lost her question. I'm sorry, Megan. Not you, Megan. The Megan that questioned me. I don't know where your question is. Dave, filibuster. Oh, wait, Dave. Weenie, how much time do you have?
Sam hasn't texted me yet, so maybe he hasn't landed. So
okay, cool. Dave. You got a Ukraine update for me today?
Oh, Shiza. We are.
No. You're supposed to say yes so I can play the.
Yes,
there you go. All right, it's his first time on the show, Harold.
I'm always ready to update on you.
All right.
Oh, we're gonna do this.
Yeah. I just need 3 minutes, please. so happy in the middle. All right, Dave, you're on 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.
All right, here we go. I shouldn't laugh about Ukraine because things are tough. All right. We are in a tight time here where the Russians are continuing to hammer at in the Avdiivka direction. They have been able, coming out of Avdiivka, they've been able to get some penetration through the Ukrainian lines and up by Chasiv Yar, which is Chasiv Yar was the town that was the entryway, was the supply line into Bakhmut. And the Russians have been coming out of Bakhmut, threatening Chasiv Yar. Those two directions have seen a lot of fighting. Meanwhile, the Russians are concentrating a large number of forces up by Kharkiv, right, or Kharkiv. Or I'm trying to figure out how to pronounce all these things, right? But so they have something like 130,000 troops that are poised up there, and so they are continuing to hammer. They are hammering the city of Kharkiv, especially with glide bombs. So what we're waiting for the ammo to arrive. We're waiting for the shipments of weaponry, our, especially artillery ammunition, to come in. We're also waiting for more air defense artillery to provide a secure environment, maybe to push back the Su-34s that are coming in with the glide bombs. And we are breathlessly awaiting the arrival of F-16s that, if they're able to operate them, and by this I mean their biggest problem with F-16s is they can only operate from a couple landing strips. They're very limited. The Russians are going to know where they live, and the Russians are going to try to target them. But if the Ukrainians can get these things working, they might be able to push back the glide bombing, right, which has been devastating against frontline positions. And so we're waiting to see this balance shift, and everyone's on tenterhooks of how bad is it going to get before it shifts. Maybe another week, right? And so right now it hangs in the balance, but it's been hanging in the balance, and the Russians haven't been able to push far through. We are coming up. Tomorrow is May 9th. The Russians are going to, it's their victory day. We'll see what they claimed. Uh, Presumably, they wanted to claim that they killed Zelensky, but that operation failed. So there's another failure on the Russian side. So that's what's going on in Ukraine. We're very close to seeing something decisive. We need to be paying attention.
Good. I have a segue for that. That's why I wanted to go to that.
Hey guys, I gotta get going. Good to see you all. Nice job.
Hi, Greg. And we're back to 3. So that's going to segue me into a question that Megan asked, not Megan on the show, Megan in the on the email thread, is the correlation. I think that's the word she was saying. Correlation between war and inflation. Is there any impact? Does war impact inflation?
It can, there are a lot of generalizations about the economic impact of war based off of the U.S. example in World War II, right? That we get just a whole lot of this view of it and these conventional wisdom ideas that war is good for business. There is nothing farther from the truth than that. War has traditionally been a disaster for economic production. It just completely distorts incentives, and so throughout human history, that's that. But we had one example in World War II where we had one country that managed to not get attacked, to not have to worry about protecting anything, that could mobilize its population, increase its productivity at the end of a recession. And we actually had the United States increasing productivity during a war, which normally doesn't happen, right? Now, prices are always a problem in war because you get massive shocks. Like we saw a pandemic disrupt supply chains. Now, our modern supply chains are very complex. They're more like webs in some ways, but traditionally wars will create massive shortages, and that absolutely creates inflation. And it's often necessary for governments to suspend market operations and ration products, because there's going to be massive diversion of production. There's going to be massive interruptions. You lose a large part of your labor supply. So, yes, there can be. I mean, so yes, you can have just incredible inflation. Usually, they don't let that happen. Usually, you go to a command economy for the during a war at some level, and it's a disaster for the economy.
Yeah, I agree. There is the supply side disruption when we are very oil dependent, very energy dependent, and this is our energy markets tend to be very international in scope, and so we have disruptions that happen from war. The other thing that David is talking about too is that there's no spending that doesn't have an opportunity cost. So you spend money on bullets and tanks, you don't spend money on education and roads. So it can have some short term demand creation, but you're driving your economy based on the war, not on what your long term strategies are or what your investments, what kind of infrastructure investments, what kind of and types of investments would you want to have within the economy. So it's disruptive, yes. It's inflationary, yes. It's distortive, yes. It's all sorts of things, but good, no.
Unless you're Vladimir Putin,
Oh,
right? Well, because again, we're talking, because the concept of economics is about maximizing social production, about trying to achieve some kind of optimal mix of things to maximize, with the given resources you have, what's the most you can make, right? What's your optimal outcome? And it's always about, the worst thing in economics that can happen is a transaction that could occur doesn't occur, right? So when you have, wow, these two guys could have gotten together and traded and both been better off and didn't have it, that is the cardinal sin. Um, that's that's a good way to think about it if you care about your economy. For dictators, the command is everything. Control of revenue is everything, and so for Putin, this all the changes that have been forced on him by his by this war, and by the sanctions, right? All of these things have a political silver lining. They give him more control over the revenue flows in the country. And even though the country is poorer, and perhaps dramatically so, he's in firmer control, because all those things you can do, all those laws you pass to control whether, to divert, for the government to divert resources, gives him the power to do it. And it gives him the ability to give people a private benefit. And so there's a perverse logic there. So, as disastrous as a war is for an economy, for a authoritarian leader's control over the economy, maybe not so much. And so we have to keep that in mind as well.
I have a thing I want to pose to tell Harold, and I have a question for Megan. Harold, when we're speaking about war, your comments on, and everybody knows this quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower: "The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is two electric power plants. It is two fine, fully equipped hospitals. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people." And I think that goes to what Megan was
What a
saying about war is
commie.
costly. And that, what's your comments on that statement? Because I think you were the one that brought that up to me years ago. That quote.
I'm not sure about that particular quote, but my thing is it's about priorities. What are our priorities? We spend more than how many different countries that we're allied with on our national defense, and our priority is to look big, to look strong, without any regard for those even who go out and protect our rights. And when they return home. So I have some issues with our defense spending. Not to mention that 60% of it goes to defense contractors and not paying our troops enough. But when I look at where our priorities are, and I say this with just about every entity that we look at, if you look at an organization, see where they spend the most money, guess what? That shows you where their true priorities are. And with us, we're all about looking big, looking strong, and not really carrying out, allowing the Constitution to be experienced by all that we consider Americans. So I'm gonna just leave it right there with that.
I can't criticize too much because some of that money goes to my military retirement and my VA benefits. So I'm going to move on to Megan. No, I'm just kidding. And I know this is back to like in the beginning when I asked a very simple question that some people know the answer to, and they would say, "Well, that's dumb," and some people literally believe this. Well, if we're hurting for money, why don't we just print more money? I know this is not my question, Harold. You already know these questions don't come from me.
I know.
If we're
But still,
hurting for
people
money,
think
why
this
don't we
way.
just
I'm
print
sorry.
more money?
Yeah. I said when I started, there are three different ways that we think about sources for inflation:
Hmm.
cost push, demand pull, and expansionary monetary policy. So you put more money in circulation, but you don't change the amount of stuff you produce. Everybody has $500 to go buy the PS whatever number you were looking for. I don't remember. Was it five?
Yes, five. Yeah.
Either five.
Yes, hey.
One of the things that drove up the prices was that there was a lot of money that had been distributed out, and people were seeking that product, and it drove the price of that up. There weren't more PS5s out in circulation; just the price of them were increasing. And even if we wanted to make more PS5s, there's a lag in time to get there, right? So you can't inflate your way out of a recession. It's a nominal change, and all you're going to do is make more inflation.
Hmm.
Dave, you look like you were going to say something.
Huh? No, I was looking at some facts relevant to what Harold was saying, but another thing about it is we in the United States we don't per se print money, right? The Federal Reserve does. They basically either buy bonds back and then they give money out, and that money goes out in the economy, or they sell bonds and pull money out of circulation. And so, the idea that we have a printing press running somewhere that makes this money in a lot of countries, that is the function of the Treasury Department, right? But in the United States, we created this little thing called the Federal Reserve, and we said we aren't going to get in. It's actually called seigniorage, the idea that you can make money by printing money, by minting money. And we largely gave up on that as a thing. And there was some talk at one point about, what if the Treasury made $1 billion coin
I
and
thought it was $1 trillion coin.
or the $1 trillion. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm Dr. Eva. I'm getting caught on that. Yeah, but the thing is that just as a practical matter, we're beyond that. We left that alone. Like we're so uninterested in doing that. We're not even going to keep the mechanism around. We're going to make it part of this management thing.
I
So
never understood the printing money thing until I actually was deployed, and I didn't know that at one time the dinar, which is the Iraqi currency, was actually more than the U.S. currency at one point in history. But Saddam Hussein did this thing where he just kept printing money. He just kept printing money, printing it, printing it, printing it, printing it, printing it, until the Iraqi dollar was basically worthless to anybody else unless you lived in Iraq. Is
Yeah,
that
and then to have
what
it
happened?
count, you have to mandate that all official transactions occur in that currency, or otherwise it doesn't have any value whatsoever.
one of the interesting things was that if you're an Iraqi, the government, the dinar is worthless. You do not keep your wealth in dinar. You keep your wealth in dollars. And so there was a lot, there were a lot of physical dollars in Iraq. They had little marketplace vendors that would trade. So, if you had savings, you transferred it into dollars and held onto the dollars. and then you would go exchange the dollars. And so Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, always had this problem of they have this black market. They would like to have you keep your money in the Iraqi currency, but they can't. And so they had this black market. The government actually would trade, but they tried to maintain an official exchange rate. They couldn't do it. They had to go off the back alley rate. And I used to say this is a great intelligence asset because you get people's bets in Iraq on what their willingness to hold dollars versus dinar tells you a lot about what these people think. And I would explain that to the military, and they sort of understood what I was talking about. But they never quite used that as much.
So I take it that the comment that someone had me put up a while ago, you and Megan aren't up for this.
What comment is that?
Printing money. No.
Megan and Dave, 2028, let's go.
Oh yeah, no.
No, me and Harold would vote for both. We would vote for you. I don't know if Harold. He's more intelligent on voting than I am. You sure? You sure? You don't want me to start this campaign? Are we saying
Megan's got
no
my
officially?
vote.
Yeah, I was gonna say, why do we have to wait to 2028? I mean,
Dave doesn't want. Well, no, I would love to see Dave debating Donald Trump.
I'm too old. It's time. It is.
Wait.
I'm too old.
Wait a minute.
For
Did he just say
millennials.
that? I know he didn't just say that. No.
No, I'm serious. It's time. I'm technically a boomer.
Well, one of the things, and the reason why it jogged me to ask that question that someone asked is why don't an economist just be president is because, and this is not to get into Trump talk, but it was Donald Trump. When you have someone who's a business, one of the things that I kept getting back in not 2020, well, 2016, right? Am I counting? Was it 2016? Trump and Hillary? It was 2016. Yeah. One of the things I was getting from a former friend of mine, because it's amazing how many people stop being your friends because you don't like the president you're voting for. He said, I'm voting for Donald Trump. He's a businessman, and that's going to help the economy. That was his whole stance.
Triggered. I am now triggered.
Why?
By this point. So I'm just warning you. The airplane is going to take a minute to land here.
Well, why do people have? It just reminds me of the economist question of why doesn't an economist be president? That would fix it. He said since Donald Trump is a businessman, he's going to run this country like a business, and he's going to fix our problems.
Right. And one thing about that is there is sometimes, especially amongst different parties, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm going to make a generalization. I think that Republicans equate economy with businessmen. The Democratic Party, since Bill Clinton, has done a good job of hiring economists. And even though those guys probably talk about stuff that a lot of progressives don't like, right, they nevertheless put up with them, right? There's a huge difference between business and economics, right? Economics is about the whole thing, right? It's about supply and demand. It's about consumers and all. Businessmen are one side. They are engaged in an activity, but they have a very limited perspective. And so the notion that businessmen understand economics is very problematic. They understand their business like nobody's business. Excuse me for saying that. But they don't have that perspective. Also, business is not the whole thing, right? Because consumers are, if you got an economist to wax poetic, right? And if you get them in a philosophical mode, which is rare, right? Most of the time they, and to Megan, no offense, but in my experience, a lot of economists don't understand the beauty of the models. They don't understand. They kind of have this view of their output, their research, and they sometimes don't get the whole thing. Where when I was at the Hoover Institution, I was around a bunch of guys who would wax poetic about this stuff. And the thing about it is that an economist will sit there, or they might, if they're thinking philosophically, they'll lecture you on the superiority of consumption over production, right? That we live to consume. Consumption is the point. production is the unfortunate necessity that precedes consumption. And so they'll say, look, we need to focus on the bundle of goods people are consuming and maximizing that, not say employment, right? Do people have jobs? Jobs are a necessary step to getting food, but that employment isn't the key, consumption is. And so they'll focus on things like lower real prices for products, greater variety of products, greater quality of products, right? And they go into all these things that are there. For the businessman, they don't care, right? The businessman is involved in a competitive thing. They see economics as competition. Economists will tend, or they should, in the philosophy of science, see it as this massive game, right? That consumers and producers come together, they engage in an exchange, they create this surplus value, and that's how the frickin' economy grows, right? So they have this pie of surplus value that we're all going to divide up. And competition is something that happens amongst producers, but not in the whole thing, right? And this kind of view is often lost on the business community because they live for competition. They are going to talk about competition, about beating folks. They'll talk about the U.S. being competitive with other people. They have a very limited perspective. So while it might be bad to have an economist as president, it's worse to have a businessman as president.
All right, let's do this because we're wrapping up. Let's get final thoughts from everybody. I'd
I
like
warned
to
you I
end
was
with
triggered.
our guest. No, it's okay. I'd like to get our guest. I know Harold's got to go. Harold, go ahead. Give us your final thoughts on the topic today.
Well, listen, it's definitely an important topic, and the fact, more importantly, it's better to help people understand how the economy run and operates. Because at the end of the day, when we look at those factors that hit it, that cause inflation, it's better to help people understand what it is that leads to it, and not put the blame all on one particular individual or individuals for that matter. Because no matter how you cut it up, it affects all of us, and we have to look forward to how we can get more so out of the situation while rather than remain in the situation. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I have to depart to go take care of my princess, but it's been a pleasure meeting you, Megan, and I look forward to for your presidential run. God bless.
I really wish my uncle would stop calling me his princess on live TV.
Wow. I am not coming to the Carolinas. Just know that.
All right,
Ciao,
let's go
guys.
to Dave. Thank you, Harold.
Go to me? Oh, I thought I thought I just had my rant.
No, that was your rant, your final thoughts on today, and we always like to end with the guests.
Honestly, I started out why we even talking about this because inflation has really come down. It's running 1% above target, and I kind of also look, are we surprised that we had this reaction, right? It's we don't need to assign political blame. We had a pandemic. It's amazing we had as little fallout as we did, and we're seeing some residual stuff. But I think we've seen in general, very competent. Remember, it might not be ideal. Non-optimal is not insufficient, right? We had competent leadership, might not have been optimal at different times, but and they stuck the landing on this thing, and I think that's kind of impressive.
Thank you. Megan, final thoughts.
Yeah, so the inflation rate is higher than we'd want it to be, but it's not high. The unemployment rate is lower than it's supposed to be, not by that much. So we're really not that far off. Like in the Etch a Sketch world, we're really pretty close to the tweak of exactly where we want to be. So I think that inflation was high last summer. Yeah. Interest rates are still high because they're not going to change policy until we start to come down to the 2% level, but they're not going to have more contractionary policy. So we're not going to see the higher interest rates, but patience and waiting for things to adjust. We can't always get the quick fix. And that's, if we always want the quick fix, we're wanting, the cake rather than the making good decisions.
Thank you, Megan. I'm so glad to meet you today. I'm so glad you're on. Hopefully, we could have you as a guest sometime in the future. That would be great. We're never going to talk about money again without you. Just letting you know that.
Okay.
No disrespect to Dave, but she's easier on the eyes. So, thank
Ah,
you.
look at her Vita and see some of her publications and think about the things that we could really ask her about,
Mhm.
right? From
Oh yeah, see,
Florida
that's the
to
one good thing I like about this show. I could have questions come from Harold, Greg, Dave, and you, and but I love getting generic questions or just questions from the everyday people in the audience that have no idea either what we're talking about or they just don't have an understanding of certain things. I feel like that's the best service um, that we do because I've said this before and my final thoughts is sometimes it's hard to learn about the economy and how it works. And like I used to tell Greg, it's very hard to learn about investing because I asked Steve Siebold, who wrote the book How Money Works. It's a very popular book because he wrote it at a seventh or eighth grade reading level. And he says it himself. Books on economics, books on investing, they're all written in a language for people who love that stuff. It's not for you to understand everyday people. We don't want you to make as much money as we do, and you get 3 pages in and you feel like you need 2 doctorates degree to understand what they're talking about. So I love that we have you guys on and kind of break it down to everybody so they can have an understanding. Thank you all again for today. I'll see you all in a couple weeks. It was a great show. Ciao.